Just before dawn on the 23rd of March, 1943, 50 German tanks rolled out of a mountain pass into a bare valley in Tunisia. The Americans waiting in the rocks knew these tanks. 5 weeks earlier, this same division had shattered an entire American corps at Kasserine, and the world had decided that day that the Americans could not fight. Now the same Panzers were coming again, across the same open ground. Every man on that ridge understood the arithmetic. If the line broke a second time, the American army might never be trusted to fight on its own again. One American general had chosen to make his stand here. Within 2 years, many of the German commanders who faced him would rate him among the most dangerous field commanders the Allies had. And yet his own side censured him and pushed him aside again and again. 3 times he did what the officers around him swore could not be done. He broke a Panzer division on the ground where his men had just been beaten. He seized the victory in a campaign built to belong to another man. And he turned an entire army 90 degrees in 2 days to reach a town already surrounded. This is the story of the 3 moves that made George Patton a legend, and the flaw that almost destroyed him first. By the last week of February 1943, the American Second Corps had stopped being an army and become the rumor of one. Kasserine had done that. In less than a week of fighting in the mountains of southern Tunisia, the Corps had lost more than 5,000 men. Nearly half of them were not counted among the dead or the wounded. They were prisoners marched east into captivity, while the rest fell back through the passes. The machines went with them: 183 tanks, 208 artillery pieces, more than 500 jeeps. All of it left burning or abandoned on ground. The Germans now walked across as if they had always owned it. On paper, the Corps still existed. In the field, it was a crowd of exhausted men, holding a line they no longer believed in, waiting for the next blow, and half certain it would finish them. And a verdict was spreading. It was the same in 2 capitals that agreed on almost nothing else. In Berlin, they said it, and in London, they said it too. The Americans could not fight. They were brave enough on the beaches and useless in the mountains. Green boys who would always break when veterans came at them in the open. That was the sentence the world had handed the United States Army, and after Kasserine, it was very hard to argue with. On the 6th of March, 1943, a new commander drove up to that broken line. He did not arrive with a plan of maneuver. He arrived with a set of rules. Mess halls would close at 7:30 in the morning and would not open again for the men who came late. Every soldier would wear his helmet and the chin strap would be fastened. Every soldier would wear his necktie and his canvas leggings in the desert, in the heat, with no exceptions offered and none accepted. And any man found out of uniform would be fined $25 on the spot. For a private, that was half a month's pay. The men hated it. They had just lived through the worst days of their lives, and the first thing this general gave them was a dress code. But one officer understood exactly what the neckties were for. Omar Bradley was the deputy commander, a quieter man who read people the way this general read terrain. Bradley saw that the rules had nothing to do with cloth. They had to do with memory. Every time a soldier knotted that tie in the heat and cursed the man who made him do it, he was being told one thing without a single word being spoken. The days before Kasserine were over. He was a soldier again, and something was expected of him again. The general was rebuilding an army by making it uncomfortable enough to remember it was an army. His name was George Patton, and discipline was only the first move. Across the line, the Germans noticed none of it. Erwin Rommel, the one enemy commander the Americans already feared by name, had flown out of Africa on the 9th of March, sick and worn thin by 2 years of desert war. He left his contempt for the American soldier behind him, and the men who took over inherited that contempt whole. Field Marshal Albert Kasserine wanted the Americans pushed back out of the eastern hills, and he expected it to be quick. The troops who would do the actual fighting on this stretch of front answered to the Italian General Giovanni Messi. And behind Messi stood the same German armor that had done the damage the first time. The 10th Panzer Division drew the assignment. It was the same division that had helped shatter the Corps at Kasserine, roughly 6,000 men, around 50 tanks still running, assault guns, and a screen of tank destroyers. and its orders pointed it straight down the road that ran east out of a small oasis town toward an American infantry division that had never once held its ground against massed armor. Every officer on the American side understood the stakes without being told. A first collapse could be explained away. A second collapse, 5 weeks later, on open ground against the same enemy, would not be a defeat. It would be the end. After that, the Americans would guard flanks and haul supplies, and other men would win the war. The town was called El Guettar. On the 18th of March, a young lieutenant colonel named William Darby had taken it with his Rangers, men who already carried his name into every fight they entered. Behind the Rangers came the 1st Infantry Division, the outfit the whole Army knew as the Big Red One, under Major General Terry Allen. And it was Allen's division that would have to stand in the valley and take the charge. Patton looked at the ground before he did anything else. This was the habit underneath all the others. He read the land the way other men read a map, and what he saw at El Guettar was a killing floor waiting to be used. The road out of the town ran into a long open valley, flat and bare and pale, walled on both sides by rocky ridges. It was perfect country for tanks to charge across, and terrible country for tanks to be caught in, so the Americans built a trap out of the landscape itself. Allen's infantry laid dense belts of mines across the mouth of the valley. Behind the mines, on the reverse slopes where the valley floor could not see them, the tank destroyers of the 601st Battalion dug themselves into the rock. Their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Herschel Baker, and Baker had watched his crews run from German armor in earlier fights, outgunned in their thin half-tracks. This time he told them the truth to their faces. They would stay, they would fight it out. Whatever the odds, they would not run again. And the artillery was registered in advance across the open ground, every likely square of it measured and marked before a single German engine started. Nothing was waiting for the Panzers in the open. Everything was waiting behind the crests. The morning of the 23rd of March, the 10th Panzer came down the valley in formation, exactly as the trap had been built to expect. They crossed the flat, pale ground with the confidence of men who had done this before and watched Americans break. Then they reached the minefield, and they stopped to clear it. That pause was the whole battle. From behind the ridges, the tank destroyers rose up over crests, fired down into armor that had nowhere to go, and reversed back out of sight before the German gunners could find them. Then again, and onto the stalled tanks came the artillery, every gun already ranged, the shells landing exactly where the maps had promised they would land. Steel poured into a valley the Germans could not leave and could not shoot their way out of. In about an hour, close to 30 German tanks were burning on the valley floor. One tank every 2 minutes. The Germans pulled back, regrouped, and came again in the afternoon. This time they sent infantry out ahead of the armor that was left, men on foot walking into the same open ground. The Americans knew it was coming. They had read the enemy's own signals and picked up the timing of the second attack before it began. And the gunners were ready. They set their shells to burst in the air above the advancing men, and they skipped rounds off the hard ground into them, and the black smoke of the airbursts hung over the valley where the infantry was dying. From the high slope, Patton watched it happen. He said it seemed almost a crime to murder good infantry that way. It is a strange thing to hear from the man who had built the machine that was doing the killing. And it is the first honest glimpse of something the legend usually leaves out. Patton was not without feeling for the men his guns were tearing apart. He simply believed the killing was the work, and he had come to Tunisia to prove he could do that work better than every officer who had written him off. The pity and the ruthlessness lived in the same man, and they always would. By the next morning, the 10th Panzer counted 26 tanks still running. Half its armored strength was gone in a single day. But the ridge had not held for free, and this is the part of El Guettar that the retelling tends to skip. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion lost 14 men and 21 of its 31 vehicles, shot to pieces in the duel it had won. And the fight did not end on the 23rd. It ground on into the first days of April, ridge after ridge, and by the time the guns finally went quiet, the Americans had paid with something on the order of 4,000 to 5,000 casualties across the wider battle. This was not the clean, effortless triumph a highlight reel would make of it. It was a bloody, grinding, expensive fight that happened to men in the right place. And the right place was everything. For the first time in the war, a veteran German Panzer division had attacked American troops in open country and been broken. Broken by men who 17 days earlier had not been trusted to hold a road. The 601st would be given a presidential unit citation for that day. The corps that had been a rumor of an army in February had become an army again. In the shape of that single day, 3 habits were already visible, and they are worth naming, because they are the whole answer to the question this story asks. The preparation was finished before anyone ordered it to begin. The blow landed at exactly the point where the enemy had decided no blow could come. And running underneath both of those was the thing the Germans would spend the next 2 years learning to dread. A speed of decision that outran what they believed an American commander was capable of. Those 3 habits would define every campaign George Patton fought after Tunisia. They were about to be tested on a far larger stage and against a far more painful obstacle than the German army. Because within 4 months, the same man who had just saved the American army in the desert would be handed the largest amphibious invasion in history. And then he would be ordered to stand aside, guard someone else's flank, and let another general win it. Operation Husky opened before dawn on the 10th of July, 1943, and it was the largest amphibious invasion the world had ever seen. More men were put ashore on the beaches of Sicily that first day than would land in Normandy 11 months later. A wind out of the northwest churned the sea and scattered the airborne drops across the dark island, drowning some men and stranding others miles from where they should have been. And still, by the strength of sheer numbers and stubborn men wading through the surf, the Allies got their foothold. The British and Canadian divisions of the 8th Army came ashore in the southeast, aimed at the direct road up the coast toward Messina. The American divisions of the 7th Army came ashore below them in the Gulf of Gela, and their job on paper was simpler than anyone in the American Army could stomach. Their job was to guard the flank. The whole plan belonged to 2 men who could not have been more different. Over all of it stood the British General Harold Alexander, calm and courteous, commanding the army group. Beneath him drove the 2 subordinates who mattered. Bernard Montgomery, careful, methodical, adored by the British public, a man who moved only when everything was stacked in his favor and then moved with crushing weight. And George Patton, who believed that weight was nothing and speed was everything, and who had just spent 4 months proving in the desert that Americans could fight. Montgomery was given the road to Messina, the prize, the finish line of the whole campaign, and Patton was given the ditch beside it. The thinking behind that decision was the thinking of Kasserine, still alive months after Kasserine was avenged. The Americans were fit to protect a British advance and nothing more. They would hold the left, they would eat the dust, and when the island fell, it would fall to Montgomery's men, and the newsreels would say so. Then, on the 13th of July, it got worse. Alexander redrew the boundary line between the 2 armies. He shifted it west, and in doing so, he handed Highway 124, one of the last good roads running north out of the American sector, over to the British. It took a route Patton's men had been about to use and gave it to Montgomery. It pushed the entire 7th Army further to the side, deeper into the role of spectator. Omar Bradley carried that order to Patton. Bradley could barely keep his voice level. He told Patton flatly that he could not allow this to stand, that the Americans were being written out of their own campaign. And here the story turns on a single choice, because Patton did not argue. He did not fire off angry cables to Alexander. He did not demand a meeting to protest the boundary. He looked at a map of an island that everyone else had already carved up, and he found the empty half. To the west lay the whole of central and western Sicily, and beyond it Palermo, the second city of the island, sitting on the north coast where no one had ordered him to go and no one had ordered him not to. On the 17th of July, Patton flew to Tunis, walked into Alexander's headquarters, and asked for permission to conduct what he called a reconnaissance in force to the west. It is worth stopping on those words because they were a weapon disguised as a request. A reconnaissance in force means a strong patrol, a probe, a few battalions feeling out the enemy and coming home. That is what Alexander heard, and Alexander, seeing no harm in letting the Americans go stir up dust in the empty part of the island, said yes. Patton did not build a patrol. He built an army. He gathered the 2nd Armored Division, the 3rd Infantry Division, and the 82nd Airborne into a provisional corps, a small striking force built for speed, and he handed it to his deputy, Jeffrey Keyes. On the 19th of July, it moved, not west to probe. West and then north, hard and fast, straight for Palermo, exactly the kind of full army advance that Alexander had never approved, and would never have approved if he had understood the phrase the way Patton meant it. Alexander understood it soon enough. As the size of the American movement became clear, orders came down for Patton to stop, to pull back into the role assigned to him, and now came the smallest and most audacious move of the entire campaign, and it was not made by Patton at all. It was made by his chief of staff, a colonel named Hobart Gay. When the signal to halt arrived at 7th Army headquarters, Gay looked at it and reported that the message had come through garbled, that the wording was unclear. He requested that it be sent again. When it came again, he found another reason it could not be acted upon and requested another repeat. He went on finding the messages garbled, politely, patiently, one after another. He kept the halt order lost in static until Palermo had fallen. The city was in American hands on the 22nd of July. In 72 hours, Keyes and his provisional corps had covered roughly 100 miles across the mountains and the dry interior of Sicily, sweeping up thousands of Italian prisoners along the way. Italian units that had no wish to die for a lost cause surrendered in droves. The people of Palermo came out into streets and cheered the Americans through them. It was a stunning piece of work, and it should be seen clearly for what it was, because the legend tends to sand off the edges. This was insubordination. Patton had taken a vague permission and stretched it past the breaking point, and his chief of staff had deliberately smothered a direct order from the army group commander. In another army, in another moment, it could have ended a career. It succeeded because it worked, and because nothing in war is forgiven faster than a victory. But Palermo was never really the point. Palermo was the 2nd city, taken in the empty half of the island, against slight resistance from men who wanted to quit. It made headlines. It did not win the campaign. Patton knew the difference, and the moment the city was his, he turned east and set his eyes on the only thing that would settle the argument with Montgomery for good. He turned towards Messina and he made it a race. The ground he chose to race across was the worst in Sicily. The north coast is a wall. The mountains of the interior run down almost to the water, ridge after ridge after ridge, each a natural fortress standing across the path, each one falling away into a narrow strip of road pinned between the rock and the sea. And falling back through that country, unhurried, professional, and deadly, was the rear guard of the German 29th Panzer Grenadier Division. The Germans did not have to win here. They only had to slow the Americans down. They held each ridge just long enough to bleed the attackers, and then they fell back to the next one and blew the coast road behind them, dropping it into the sea so that every mile had to be rebuilt before it could be crossed. It was the kind of fighting that eats divisions and weeks. A straight punch up that coast, ridge by ridge, would have cost a division and taken a month, and Montgomery was moving on the other side of the island. So Patton refused to punch straight. If the mountains came down to the sea, then he would go around them by sea. He put infantry battalions onto landing ships, sent them out into the water at night, and landed them on the coast behind the German line. Behind the ridge the enemy was defending, so that while the main body of the division pressed the Germans from the front, another force appeared in their rear and cut the road they were falling back along. Leapfrog, ridge by ridge, hook by hook, using the water as a door around every fortress the mountains built. The first of these landings went in near the town of Sant'Agata on the 8th of August, and it worked cleanly enough. The German position came unglued, and roughly 1,000 prisoners fell into American hands as the enemy scrambled to get out of the trap before it closed. The second landing was the one that nearly went into the sea. The target was a stretch of coast near the town of Brolo, behind a height called Monte Cipolla, and the man who was supposed to order it forward did not want to do it. Lucien Truscott commanded the 3rd Infantry Division, and Truscott was no coward and no fool. He was one of the finest fighting generals the American Army had, a tough, plain, professional soldier. And he looked at the Brolo plan and saw a battalion being rowed out beyond the reach of help, put ashore behind a division of Germans with no sure way to reach them if the timing slipped. He wanted it postponed until the main advance was close enough to link up quickly. Patton refused, and when Truscott pressed the point, Patton asked him whether he was afraid to fight. It was a cruel thing to say to a man like Truscott, and it landed exactly as it was meant to. Truscott held his temper and answered that if Patton doubted his nerve, he could hand the division to any other officer he pleased. He would obey the order, but he wanted it on the record that he thought it was wrong. The landing went in on the 11th of August. 650 men under a lieutenant colonel named Lyle Bernard came ashore in the dark behind Monte Cipolla. They climbed the height, they dug in, and they cut Highway 113, the single coast road that the entire German rear guard was depending on to escape. For a few hours it was perfect, a small force sitting on the enemy's only artery, exactly where it hurt most. Then the Germans understood what had happened, and the 29th Panzer Grenadier turned around. A whole veteran division, or the fighting corps of one, wheeled about and came at 650 men on a hill. They came with tanks, and with artillery, and with infantry, and they came with the desperation of men who had just found their road home cut behind them. Bernard's little force held the height and took everything the Germans could throw up at it, and the day became a slow, grinding fight for survival with the sea at their backs and no easy way down. The whole battle lived inside the desperation of Bernard's radio calls that afternoon. His men were being counterattacked in strength, and the messages coming off that hill amounted to a single plea. Reach us. Do it now, before it is too late. A man on a hill with his command dying around him, calling out to anyone who could hear, not asking for a plan or a promise, only for the army to reach him before the end. Of his 650 men, 177 became casualties in a single day, more than 1 in 4. Most of his supporting guns were smashed. The main advance clawed its way forward along the coast, fighting to reach the height before it was overrun. And it held. Barely, and at a terrible price, it held. The road stayed cut at the hour it needed to be cut, and with their escape routes severed and Americans in their rear, the German position on the north coast came apart. Rearguard that had made the Allies pay for every ridge was finally forced to run faster than it could fight. Everything Patton had built his reputation on was in that single reckless landing. The blow struck where the enemy was certain it could not be struck, behind their own lines, out of the sea. The speed that outran what the Germans thought possible. And underneath the brilliance, the cost. Truscott had been right about the risk. Bernard's men had paid it in blood. The gamble had come within a few hours and a few hundred casualties of being remembered as a massacre instead of a masterstroke. That is the thing about this way of making war. When it works, it is genius. When it fails, it is a slaughter with a general's name on it. And the line between the two is thinner than the legend will ever admit. In the dark hours before dawn, on the 17th of August 1943, an American patrol walked into Messina. They had made it. Patton had won his race. His men had entered the prize city ahead of Montgomery's 8th Army by a matter of hours, and the campaign for Sicily was over in 38 days. For a man who had been ordered to guard a flank and eat the dust, it was total vindication. The Americans had not held the ditch. They had won the finish line, and then came the sting, and it is the part of the story that separates history from legend. Because while Patton was racing Montgomery for the honor of walking into Messina first, the Germans had been using those same days for something far more important than honor. They had been getting out. The strait between Sicily and the mainland of Italy is barely 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. And across that narrow band of water, while the Allies fought each other for the credit of arriving, the Axis ran one of the most successful evacuations of the entire war. The Germans ferried out close to 40,000 of their own troops, more than 9,000 vehicles, 47 tanks, most of their artillery, and the Italians brought back around 60,000 men on top of that. The soldiers who had made the Allies bleed for every ridge on the north coast. the men of the 29th Panzergrenadier, and the divisions beside themselves, the professionals, who were the only thing worth capturing on the whole island, stepped calmly onto the ferries and crossed to Italy to fight another day. Many of them would be waiting at Salerno. Many would be waiting at Anzio. Many would still be killing Americans a year and a half later in the mountains of Italy. Patton had taken Sicily. He had not taken the German army in Sicily. And the race that made him famous, the dash for Messina that the newsreels loved, was in cold truth a competition for a prize, while the real prize sailed away across 3 kilometers of water that no one had moved decisively to close. 7th Army had lost close to 9,000 men in those 38 days, roughly 235 men every single day of the campaign. They had fought superbly, and they had proven everything Patton set out to prove. And at the end of it, the enemy they had come to destroy had simply gone home. The pattern had held, the plan prepared before permission arrived, the movement faster than the enemy could answer. The blow landed where the ground itself was supposed to make it impossible. Patton had done what he always did, and he had done it against his own high command as much as against the Germans. But the same weeks that made him a legend were quietly building the thing that would nearly destroy him, and it had nothing to do with the enemy at all. Twice during the Sicily campaign, Patton walked into evacuation hospitals behind the lines to visit the wounded, the way commanders did. On the 3rd of August, and again on the 10th, he came upon soldiers who bore no visible wound, men who had been sent back from the front not with torn flesh but with shattered nerves. Shell shock, battle fatigue, the invisible casualty of men who had simply reached the end of what a human mind can carry. Patton did not understand it, and he refused to. To him, in that moment, a man in a hospital bed with no wound was a coward taking up space meant for the truly injured. And in front of doctors and nurses and other patients, he lost control. He cursed those soldiers. He called them cowards. He struck them. He slapped a sick man across the face in a hospital ward and ordered him back to the front. It is one of the ugliest scenes in the whole American war, and it cannot be softened because it was not a moment of tactical hardness. It was a general assaulting his own wounded. The men he struck were suffering from an injury the army itself would later recognize and treat. Patton was not being tough. He was being cruel to the very soldiers he claimed to fight for. Word reached Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, who was holding the entire Allied coalition together by sheer patience. Eisenhower knew exactly what he had in Patton. He knew there was no other American general who could move an army the way this one could. And he knew that this same man had just done something that could not be excused and might not be survivable. Eisenhower did not court-martial him. He could not afford to lose the weapon, but he sent Patton a blistering private letter, and he ordered him to apologize. To the soldiers he had struck, to the medical staff who had watched, to the divisions of the 7th Army, unit by unit, standing in formation, while their conquering general admitted he had been wrong. And so, at the very height of his triumph, in the same weeks that his men walked into Messina ahead of the British, George Patton stood in front of his own troops and apologized for what he had done. The man who had just saved a campaign was reduced to explaining himself to the soldiers he had led to win it. The enemy across the strait had escaped him. His own temper had very nearly finished him, and the price of those 2 slaps was not yet paid in full, because when the greatest invasion in history was being planned for the beaches of Normandy, the most aggressive commander the Allies possessed would be left off the list. Sicily, held in reserve, made to wait while lesser men were handed the war. The Germans would spend the next year wondering where he was. The Germans spent the next year wondering where he was, and the Allies let them wonder. When the great invasion finally came to Normandy in June of 1944, Patton was not on the beaches. He had been kept back, held in the shadows, his very name turned into a weapon of deception aimed at the German high command. But by the winter of that year, he was in France at last, commanding the 3rd Army, driving east toward Germany with the same speed that had always been his signature. And it was in that winter, in the frozen middle of December 1944, that he was asked to do the one thing no staff in Europe believed an army could do. On the 16th of December, more than 200,000 German troops and close to 1,000 tanks came out of the Ardennes forest and fell on a thinly held stretch of American line. It was Hitler's last great gamble in the West. The goal was to punch through, cross the River Meuse, and drive all the way to the port of Antwerp, splitting the American and British armies clean in two. Within days, a town called Bastogne, where 7 roads met in the snow, was surrounded, and inside it, cut off, low on ammunition, low on everything, sat the men of the 101st Airborne Division. The entire German plan rested on one assumption. Winter would ground the Allied aircraft, the roads would stay sheets of ice, and no Allied army fighting in one direction could break off, turn, and redeploy fast enough to matter. The German staff had done the arithmetic carefully, and the arithmetic was sound. It had simply been done about the wrong man. Patton's Third Army was attacking east toward the Saar when the Ardennes broke open to the north, and here is the detail that tells you everything about how his mind worked. On the 18th of December, before anyone at the top had asked him for a thing, Patton went to his staff and told them to stop planning the war they were fighting and start planning opposite. Disengage the whole army from its eastward attack, turn it 90 degrees, drive north into the disaster. His chief of staff, Hobart Gay, the same man who had once Nosebald orders so conveniently garbled in Sicily, went to work with the operations officer, Halley Maddox. And they did not draft one plan. They drafted 3, one for each direction the army might be ordered to go. Each one worked out down to the road priorities and the march tables, each one given a code word. On the 19th of December, Eisenhower called his commanders to a cold stone barracks at Verdun. The room was grim. The front was collapsing, and no one could see the bottom of it. Eisenhower asked how soon anyone could counterattack into the German flank. And Patton said he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The senior officers around that table did not believe it. It was not disbelief in his nerve. It was disbelief in physics. To pull an army out of one battle, wheel it 90 degrees on icy roads in the dead of winter, and throw it into a new battle 100 miles away in 2 days was simply not a thing armies did. Eisenhower himself told him to take 3 days rather than go in piecemeal. Then Patton walked to a telephone, spoke a single prearranged code word to his headquarters, and an entire army began to move. No new orders had to be written in that room. No conference had to be held. The staff work had been finished 36 hours earlier in the dark, before anyone believed it would be needed. One sentence released it, and what followed was the largest and fastest redeployment of the war in Europe. More than 133,000 vehicles were rerouted across the frozen countryside. 63,000 tons of supplies were shifted in 5 days. 57 tons of maps went out to units that had been fighting on entirely different ground that same morning. 20,000 miles of signal wire were strung through the snow just to keep the moving army talking to itself. When the attack finally opened, more than 1,000 guns stood behind it, and through it all, Patton was not in a Warren quarters moving pins on a board. He was out in an open jeep in the killing cold, working the icy crossroads himself, untangling jams, and putting his own shoulder to trucks stuck in ruts alongside the drivers who drove them. He had done one more thing, too, that tells you how he understood the men he led. Back on the 8th of December, before any of this, he had gone to his chaplain, a colonel named James O'Neill, and asked him to write a prayer for good weather. Then he had 250,000 copies of it printed and put into the hands of his soldiers. On the 23rd of December, the skies over the Ardennes finally cleared, the fighter bombers rose, and the trapped town could at last be supplied from the air. Patton said the chaplain had done some potent praying. He pinned a medal on him for it. It was half a joke. It was also exactly the kind of gesture that made men follow him into a winter like that one. Inside Bastogne, on the 22nd of December, a German party had come forward under a white flag and demanded that the Americans surrender. The acting commander of the 101st, a brigadier general named Anthony McAuliffe, answered with a single word: nuts. His own officers had to explain to the confused Germans that it meant, roughly, go to hell. Patton's relief attack had already jumped off that same day, before the German envoys ever reached the line. The 4th Armored Division led it, grinding north over frozen roads against German infantry, dug into every rise, across roughly 100 miles of ground from where the week had started. It was slow, and it was bloody, and it was nothing like a rescue in a movie. On the afternoon of the 26th of December, the spearhead reached the village of Assenois, the last obstacle before the town. Creighton Abrams, a young lieutenant colonel who commanded the lead armor, sent his tanks straight at it, while more than 2,000 artillery rounds fell on the village in minutes, the tanks driving through the very edge of their own barrage. At about 10 minutes to 5 in the evening, the lead Sherman, a tank named Cobra King, broke through the last of the German positions south of the town. Its commander, Lieutenant Charles Bogus, rolled forward and was met on the road by a lieutenant of the 326th Airborne Engineers named Duane Webster. The corridor into Bastogne was open. Patton had done what the staffs of Europe had sworn could not be done for the 3rd time. But it had not been cheap, and the truth of it matters more than the myth. The 4th Armored Division lost around 1,000 men reaching that town. Abrams' tank battalion was worn down to roughly 20 tanks, his lead company to 4. The corridor they opened was a thin and bleeding thread, and the fighting to hold it and widen it would grind on for weeks. And across the Ardennes as a whole, American losses in just the first 18 days ran to more than 41,000 men. That is close to 100 casualties every hour, around the clock for 2.5 weeks. The men of the 101st, for their part, never much cared for the word rescue. They had held Bastogne when they were surrounded, and they believed they would have held it whether Patton arrived or not. There is a hardness in that pride that is worth respecting. The relief of Bastogne was a magnificent feat of movement and will. It was not a miracle, and it was not one man saving another. It was thousands of soldiers dying in the snow so that a line on a map could be redrawn. Patton himself called the relief of Bastogne the finest thing his army ever did. And when the war in Europe was finally over, the men who had spent 2.5 years being told that Americans could not fight had learned better, and they said so. German commanders who had faced him spoke of him afterward with a respect they gave to almost no other Allied general. They described him as one of the most aggressive armored commanders the Allies had put in the field, a man of sudden action whose way of making war came closest to their own, a general who preferred vast sweeping movements, took enormous risks, and won enormous results. Some of that reputation had been inflated on purpose, built up by the very deception that kept him off the Normandy beaches. But the core of it was earned, ridge by ridge and river by river in blood, and then the strangest ending of all. The war ended, and George Patton, who had lived his entire life for the next battle, found that there were no more battles to fight. He did not fit the quiet that followed. He never had. And on the 9th of December 1945, on a road near Mannheim in occupied Germany, the car he was riding in collided with a truck at low speed. It was an ordinary accident, almost nothing, but it broke his neck and left him paralyzed, and he lingered for 12 days in a hospital bed, the one place in the world he had spent his life running from. He died on the 21st of December 1945, not on a battlefield, not under fire, in a bed from an accident that would have left most men bruised. The general who could turn an entire army 90 degrees in the dead of winter, who broke a Panzer division on the ground where his men had just been beat, who seized the victory in a campaign built to belong to another man, was killed by a slow-moving truck on a road 7 months after the guns fell silent. He was buried in the American cemetery in Luxembourg, and at his own wish, he was laid among the soldiers of his Third Army. The men he had driven through the snow to Bastogne, the ordinary boys he had ordered to knot their necktie in the desert until they remembered they were soldiers again. He rests there still, one white marble cross in a field of thousands, exactly the same size as all the rest. The man who lived for war, lying forever among the men it took. There is no better ending for him than that, and no more honest one.